Greetings Autobots and welcome back to Autobot ASMR. Tonight I figured I would jump back in with The Meg by Steve Alden and continue reading it for you guys because the first video, while it didn't perform as well as my Transformers videos, it still did really well for the video of its kind of video. So I said, you know what, may as well make more. So we're not going to waste too much time with this intro. We're just going to pop in with chapter 2 of this book. Now, if I've lost my page, oh dearie me. There we are. Let me just get into a position so you guys can see the book and I can see it better because my light bulb is currently on the frets. The Professor, the Scripps Institute, Anderson Auditorium, La Jolla, California. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Sorry if I pronounced that horribly wrong. November 8th, 5:42 p.m. Jonas Taylor stopped the projector as the image of a megalodon feeding upon the T-Rex began to pixelate on the big screen. The house slides came up, allowing the 37-year-old paleobiologist to look out at his audience on just under 50 attendees. Most of the seats empty. I hope you enjoyed our little match of the Titans. For the record, T-Rex and Carcharodon Megalodon never actually shared the same time period on our planet. Tyrannosaurus Rex lived during the late Cretaceous and died off about 65 million years ago after an asteroid struck the Earth. The Megalodon's reign began during the Miocene period, about 35 million years later, and lasted until the dawn of modern man. Other than that, the film is fairly accurate. Megalodon was a real monster, the prehistoric cousin of our modern-day great white shark, only it was 50 to 70 feet long and weighed close to 70,000 pounds. Its head alone was probably as large as a Dodge Ram pickup. Its jaws could have engulfed and swallowed half a dozen grown men whole. And I haven't even mentioned the teeth. Razor sharp, 6 to 7 inches long, each possessing serrated edges like a steel steak knife. The former deep-sea submersible pilot loosened his collar and took a slow, deep breath, knowing he had his audience's attention. Of course, lecturing in front of a sparse crowd was disappointing. Jonas knew his theories were controversial, that there were as many critics in the audience as there were supporters. Still, just to be heard, to feel important again. Fossilized megalodon teeth found around the world tell us the species dominated the oceans over most of the last 30 million years. Some experts believe the species perished about 2 million years ago as a result of the last ice age. Others have found teeth that date back a mere 100,000 years. From a geological perspective, either estimate is just a tick of the clock, and there's little doubt our two species shared the planet at the same time. The big question, of course, is why did the most fearsome predator in Earth's history die off at all? If the great white shark survived the last ice age, why not its prehistoric cousin? Jonas loosened his collar a bit more. He rarely wore suits, and this 8-year-old wool jacket itched like hell. Those of you who read my book are aware of how my opinions often differ from those of most paleobiologists. Many in my field spend a great deal of time theorizing why a particular species no longer exists, while I prefer to focus my research on how a seemingly extinct species might still exist. A broad-chested man in his mid-50s stood from his seat in the first row, demanding to be heard. Jonas recognised Lee Udelsman. His former colleague at Scripps had become an outspoken critic. Professor Taylor, I spent $29.95 on your book and I read it from cover to cover. I was left with the impression that you actually believe Carcharodon Megalodon may still be roaming our oceans. Is that true? The audience murmured, waiting for the answer they had come to hear. Jonas composed himself. Be careful. The wrong quote will kill your credibility, not to mention book sales. Do I believe vast numbers of megs may still be roaming our oceans? Not all, Professor Udelsman. I'm simply pointing out that as scientists, we tend to take a rather short-sighted, if we haven't seen it, it doesn't exist anymore approach when it comes to declaring certain marine animals extinct. For instance, scientists once believed the coelacanth, a species of lobe-finned fish that thrived 300 million years ago, had gone extinct over the last 70 million years. That so-called fact held up until 1938 when a fisherman hauled a living coelacanth out of the deep waters of South Africa. Now scientists routinely observe these living fossils in their natural habitats. Lee Udelsman held his ground. Professor Taylor, we're all familiar with the discovery of the coelacanth, but I think you'll agree there's a big difference between a 5-foot bottom feeder and a 60-foot predatory shark. Jonas checked his watch, realizing he was running behind schedule. Yes, I agree. My point was simply that I prefer to investigate the possibility of a species' survival rather than add to any unproven conjecture regarding extinction among marine dwellers. I often hear critics state that if Megalodon were still alive, we'd have seen one by now, at least a dead one that washed ashore. That statement is ridiculous. First, the oceans are vast, and sharks have no reason to surface just to show a passing boat their telltale dorsal fin. As far as the remains of a dead meg washing ashore, it's a physiological fact that dead sharks don't float, they sink. Other predators devour the meat, leaving behind the cartilage, which dissolves in seawater. All that's left are the animal's teeth, which end up buried on the seafloor. Agreed, but you still haven't answered my question, Professor Taylor. Do you believe Megalodon is still alive? The audience applauded. Jonas glanced at his watch. 10 minutes late. Maggie's going to be pissed. Toss Udelsman some red meat, sign a few books, and call it a night. From strictly a logical scientific standpoint, yes, Professor, I believe it's possible. We know Megalodon's major food source, whales, were still quite abundant following the last ice age, so there was plenty to eat. As far as colder temperatures affecting the creatures, we know that the internal anatomy of larger sharks, like the great white, functions like an internal heat factory. The meg's moving muscles could channel gobs of hot blood into its extremities through a process known as gigantothermy, enabling it to adapt to even the coldest temperatures. The question is, what happened? Obviously, there was a great die-off. In my opinion, Megalodon's 30 million year reign was terminated by the rise of the killer whale. Pods of orca numbering 20 to 40 adults decimated meg nurseries, which were relegated to the shallows. Over time, the adult sharks died off and the species bottomed out. His former colleague wasn't through, turning Jonas's night into a two-man show. You're contradicting yourself, Taylor. You just said Megalodon might still be out there. Correct. A decimated population doesn't necessarily equate to extinction. Orcas may be the wolves at the shallows, but they can't inhabit the mid-waters of the ocean, let alone the abyss. Prior to 1977, many scientists, no doubt you among them, believed the abyss was actually barren. After all, how could life exist without light, without photosynthesis? When we actually bothered to take a look, we discovered hydrothermal vents, miniature volcanoes of life-giving chemicals, spewing mineral-rich waters at temperatures that exceed 700 degrees Fahrenheit. In some cases, these minerals will level off about half a mile or so above the seafloor, creating a layer of insulation that keeps in the heat, forming what we call a hydrothermal plume. In essence, you have an anomaly of nature, a tropical oasis of life running along the very bottom of the ocean, separated from the surface by a frigid layer of water. These hydrothermal vents and their minerals anchor vast chemosynthetic food chains, some of which could support a subspecies of Megalodon. A middle-aged woman stood, her teenage son squirming in the seat next to her. You'll be happy to know my son Brandon agrees with you about Megalodon still being alive. However, as a middle school marine biology teacher, I'd like to know if you actually have any proof these monster sharks are residing in the abyss. Jonas forced a smile while he waited for the crowd's applause to subside. Now, let me show you something that was discovered in the abyss more than 100 years ago. From a shelf inside the podium, Jonas pulled out a glass case, roughly twice the size of a shoebox. Inside was a triangular grey tooth that was as large as his hand. This is a fossilized tooth of Carcharodon megalodon. Scuba divers and beachcombers have turned up fossilized teeth like this by the thousands. Some are tens of millions of years old. This particular specimen is special because it's not very old. It was recovered in 1873 by the world's first true oceanic exploration vessel, the British HMS Challenger. Can you see these manganese nodules? Jonas pointed to the black incrustations on the tooth. Recent analysis of these manganese layers indicate the tooth's owner had been alive during the late Pleistocene or early Holocene period. In other words, this tooth is a mere 10,000 years old, and it was dredged from the deepest point on our planet, the Mariana Trenches, Challenger Deep. The teen pumped his fist. Ha! Told you, Mom. You owe me $20. Jonas held up his hand, attempting to quiet a dozen side conversations as his eyes shifted to a beautiful blonde making her way carefully down the centre aisle in stiletto heels. Tan and in her early 30s, she was wearing a topaz evening gown which hugged her flawless figure. Her male escort, also in his 30s, trailed behind, his long dark hair slicked back into a tight ponytail which contrasted with his conservative tuxedo. Jonas waited for his wife and friend to be seated in the second row. Please, if you'll give me a minute, I'll explain my theory which is detailed in my new book, and then I have to wrap things up. Silence took the room. Following the last ice age 2 million years ago, megalodon pups inhabiting the shallow water nurseries along the Mariana Archipelago would have gone deep in order to escape pods of killer whales. Descending to the Mariana Trench, these juvenile sharks would have discovered warm bottom waters insulated by hydrothermal plumes. Given these variables, members of the megalodon nursery might have chosen to remain in the deep, surviving to breed a new generation of deep water monsters. Scientists may or may not agree with my theory, however. Any answer rendered without a scientific investigation behind it, meaning an actual expedition into the Mariana Trench, is simply worthless conjecture. What nonsense! Mike the Turk Tersman, a popular local radio talk show host specialising in cryptozoology, stood from his 10th row seat, shouting to be heard, "There are no vents in the Mariana Trench. None!" Jonas shook his head. He had heard excerpts of the Turk's recent interview with Richard Ellis, a painter and self-proclaimed expert in all things nautical who had lambasted Taylor's research. "You're wrong, Mr. Tersman. The Ocean Exploration Ring of Fire expedition recently used satellite aperture radar to survey the Mariana Trench. They discovered more than 50 underwater volcanoes, 10 of which possessed active hydrothermal systems. These hydrothermal systems were quite different from those found along the mid-Atlantic ridges, potentially harbouring all sorts of exotic life forms. So maybe the next time one of your guests decides to publicly critique my research over the airwaves, you'll do some fact-checking of your own." A smattering of applause escorted the Turk back to his seat. "Professor Taylor, an important question." He looked up, searching the auditorium for the woman that called out his name. It was an Asian American beauty in her late 20s. Her long, jet black hair was pulled into a tight bun, her white blouse tied around her midriff, revealing a taut stomach, her jeans torn at the knees, ending in Gucci heels. "I know her from somewhere." "Yes, go on, please." "Before you began studying these megalodons, your career was focused entirely on piloting deep-sea submersibles. I'd like to know why, at the peak of your career, you suddenly quit." Jonas was taken aback by the directness of her question. "First, I didn't quit. I retired. Second, my reasons are mine, and mine alone. Next question." He searched the audience for another raised hand. "Pretty young to retire, aren't you?" Heads turned as the Asian beauty approached from one of the side aisles. "Or maybe it was something else? You haven't been in a submersible for, what, 7 years? Did you lose your nerve, Professor? Inquiring minds want to know." The audience chuckled. No one was leaving. This was getting good. Jonas felt trickles of sweat drip from his armpits. "What's your name, miss?" "Tanaka. Terry Tanaka. I believe you know my father, Masao, CEO of the Tanaka Oceanographic Institute." "Tanaka, of course. In fact, I think you and I met several years ago on a lecture circuit." "That's right. Well, Terry Tanaka, since your inquiring mind insists on violating my privacy, let's say after almost 10 years with the Navy, I felt it was time to stop risking my life piloting deep-sea submersibles. And so I went back to school to pursue my doctorate degree in order to research prehistoric species like the megalodon." Jonas collected his notes. "Now, if there are no other questions, Dr. Taylor, please." A balding man in his 50s wearing bifocals and a UCLA hooded sweatshirt stood in the third row off to his left. "You mentioned the Mariana Trench as a potential habitat for any surviving megalodon. Has the trench ever been explored?" "Unfortunately, no. There were 2 manned expeditions back in 1960, but in both cases the bathyscapes merely went to the bottom and resurfaced. It's important to understand just how big this gorge is and how dangerous it is to access. We're essentially talking about a 1,500-mile-long canyon that is over 40 miles wide, located 7 miles below the surface. The water pressure alone is 16,000 pounds per square inch." We actually know more about distant galaxies than we do the bottom of our own oceans. Well stated. But, Professor, aren't you forgetting about a few more recent descents into the Mariana Trench, specifically the Challenger Deep? Jonas stared at the man, red warning flags fluttering in his head. I'm sorry? Come now, Professor. You made several dives there yourself, 7 years ago to be exact, before your so-called retirement from the Navy. Jonas felt the blood drain from his face as a buzz of excitement took the sparse crowd. From the front row, Maggie motioned impatiently at her watch, her eyes tossing daggers his way. I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I have another engagement. I'm getting my information from the same source that told me you were dishonorably discharged from the Navy following a 3-month stint in a mental ward. Something about post-traumatic stress brought on by the death of 2 civilians aboard a deep-sea Navy submersible. A submersible you were piloting in the Mariana Trench. You son of a bitch, that information's classified. Chaos broke out as the audience yelled at questions, and 3 photographers rushed forward to snap photos, blinding Jonas with their purple flashes as he searched for his wife, who was already making her escape back up the centre aisle with his friend. Climbing down from the stage, he attempted to chase after them, only to be cut off by students calling out questions and Mike Tersman demanding answers. He was forced to sign 3 books as he apologised for having to run, then managed to squeeze his way up the aisle before the Asian beauty intercepted him at the auditorium doors. We need to talk. Call my literary agent, Tenakade. He's in the book. Pushing past her, he exited through the lobby to the street, banging his knee as he jumped in the back seat of an awaiting limousine. Well, that's chapter 2 for the night, folks. It's like, I just love this book. I love how it starts off with a bang, where we've got this big killer shark and this really cool old shark thing. But then the second chapter kicks us off with the main character, and as I said in my previous video, the book actually, I prefer the way Jonas is in the book to the movie. Don't get me wrong, Jason Statham, phenomenal actor, and I love the idea of him getting more roles. But this Jonas, I just imagine being a bit more, I don't know, maybe a bit more lonely, maybe even a bit more, I wouldn't say unhinged, but a bit more eccentric. But, well, as you can tell from the front cover and title of the book, you know, his theory does end up turning out to be true. So, yeah, you know what? I suppose this book has a lesson for us all, you know. Always do your research, because you never know whenever you're going to discover the next big thing. Like, I don't know, a new flower, or a new species of frog, or, I don't know, a giant 60-foot killer shark. It could happen. But, enough of my rambling. This has been The Meg, Chapter 2, with Orobot ASMR. I hope you enjoyed this video, folks. I love doing these reading videos for you guys, especially as it gives me a way to just talk about these books as well, while also showing them off to you all to enjoy. So, with all being said and done, Autobots, transform and roll out to bed. Till all are one.